Muchas gracias. Bueno, vamos a comenzar con la última ponencia plenaria del Congreso. Es un verdadero honor y un placer para el Congreso poder contar con la presencia y participación de Gwyneira-Isaac, doctora en antropología por la Universidad de Oxford y conservadora de tecnología de América del Norte en el Museo Nacional de Historia Natural del prestigioso Smithsonian Institution, una institución administrada y financiada por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos con 178 años de historia. Gwyneira-Isaac es actualmente la directora del programa Recovering Voices, Recuperando Voces, de dicha institución, un programa que apoya a las comunidades nativas americanas y sus esfuerzos por revitalizar sus lenguas en peligro de extinción y preservar sus conocimientos tradicionales. Su investigación especializada se centra en la intersección entre los sistemas de conocimiento nativos y los no nativos en Norteamérica. También es una de las principales impulsoras de la iniciativa Indigenous, cuyo objetivo es respaldar a académicos y a comunidades indígenas en el uso de la tecnología para la revitalización lingüística. Finalmente, es la fundadora del proyecto Convening, nombramos una plataforma que reúne a académicos internacionales para el estudio de los diversos sistemas de conocimiento que configuran la política del lenguaje, los nombres y los procesos de denominación. El título de la ponencia que nos va a ofrecer hoy aquí es International Approaches to Convening Language and Culture via Museums and Archives, enfoques internacionales para la convergencia de lengua y cultura a través de museos y archivos. Thank you very much. You may begin your talk whenever you want.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Lo siento, no hablar español. So I'll be speaking in English, and as much as possible, we will try and translate and have a discussion afterwards. So I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee of this conference, and Roberto and Avelino. You've shown me tremendous generosity in inviting me and taking care of me. I also thank the audience for joining us today, and I'm grateful to have the chance to be with you and to be part of this wonderful conference. Also, in feeding me Asturian style, you have made a friend for life, and I hope to return the generosity in the US when you come to visit. So although my Spanish is definitely not something you would want to be subjected to, so I think English is an improvement here on my Spanish. Today I will address some obvious aspects involved in language revitalization methodology. While obvious, however, they are also the very things that are overlooked by dominant institutions who have the power and the funding, especially regarding academic and national grants. In effect, I believe we need to rethink how we build the very relationships that are at the heart and the pathos of language revitalization. And some of this goes against the conventional academic grain, but we can discuss this afterwards. I'm curious to hear what you think during the question time and to see where it might lead us in our revitalization efforts. So I start with this slide with the many languages. This is a sort of a 5-year window of the languages that we were working with the Recovering Voices program. So we support Indigenous and minority language communities from around the world. What I like about learning about how people greet each other, buenos dias, it's a good day. In the Anishinaabe language, it is, I see your light. So el saludo Anishinaabe que significa veo tu luz. Entonces, así es como comenzamos. Empiezo reconociendo la maravillosa. Do you want to read it?
Energía entre ese grupo de académicos y de lingüistas y aquí en adelante. Estoy para después.
So I'm here for you. So I want to share how I came to be the person as a scholar, who I am and what matters to me. I was born into a Welsh-speaking family who were fiercely protective and proud of their language. I did not learn Welsh. That's part of the story. And the elders named all of the grandchildren very archaic Welsh names. So in my case, my name Gwyneira means white snow. So as you can hear from the Neira, in my name, it mirrors the term for snow that is used here. So we share some language roots. Growing up in England and the US, my name required far more explanation than people had the patience for. So early on, I became attuned to the challenges presented to minority language speakers. While initially trained in the fine arts, I found my academic home in anthropology, as I enjoy its truly expansive and interdisciplinary nature. My first forays into fieldwork were with Native American Puebloan communities in New Mexico and Arizona in the United States. Through this experience, I witnessed firsthand how people in these communities had to bridge Puebloan and Anglo-American knowledge systems. The real issue is pedagogy. They're very different in how you teach, how you learn, and how you think about the value of knowledge. So it is this topic that I now specialize in, which is the intersection between different cultural knowledge systems, especially how Native American communities navigate these and have maintained their knowledge throughout colonial regimes of the Spanish, the Mexican, and US governments. I also now look at the intersection between Native American and Anglo-American concepts of health and well-being, and finding ways to bridge these with concepts like traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. So what is the work that I do? My research eventually brought me to the Smithsonian Institution as the curator of North American ethnology, and now as the director of the Colored Voices. I was particularly interested in joining this institution as the collection and archives from the Southwest Pueblos are unparalleled. It's an amazing collection. It's the largest in the world from this one small community. But I was very aware from my interview at the Smithsonian that most Zunis I work with had no access or no knowledge of this collection. It is completely removed from their day-to-day lives. So I took the job at the Smithsonian with this idea of bridging the community with the museum. I'm also interested in interdisciplinary research within the museum and across the museum, so that it more effectively mirrors the way we live our life. We don't live our life in a bird sanctuary every day, or a bird collection, or in a kitchen all day. We live in an environment that is cohesive and connected. But museums and the academy, we have nice siloed disciplines. But how, when you're revitalizing the language, how do you do that? You need to have all of your facets of knowledge come together. So that's part of the challenge that we're working on within this kind of project within a museum setting. So we encourage communities who come and visit, and this is the illustration up here is a good example. The Wauja are from the Xingu Valley in Brazil. It takes them sometimes 2 weeks to 2 months to get to Washington, D.C. They have to take a riverboat, a bus, and then they take a month or so to get visas and passports. And eventually they come to DC, and they have to have a translator come with them because they definitely do not have English. They're going from Wauja to Portuguese and then Portuguese to English. So this is quite a commitment, but we have amazing partners who work with the Wauja people who help bring the group. But they're far more interested in the natural history collections than the ethnographic collections, because to them, that is their world. And they want their children and their grandchildren to know all of the stories that go with each animal. So they share them within the collection, and then that is recorded with the idea that it is safe. This is an interesting point. At the Smithsonian, there may be nowhere at home where this can be kept. So this is the kind of work that I am doing and thinking about, and trying to, think about the methodology, what's important. So my focus as director is building a collaborative research program with communities that bridge Indigenous and Western knowledge systems through linking humanities and natural sciences. I focus on establishing international partnerships to ensure the exchange of expert knowledge between Indigenous and minority communities and the academic world. And the idea is to build a living knowledge network. So language that is vital and alive and mobilized and moving. So here's a few points. I put them up as a text. I will talk through them, but these are some of the main points that I think museums bring to this discussion. So one of the key findings is that museums are exceptionally unique places that enable scholars to bridge diverse knowledge and media. So it's not just what you know, it's that it's embodied in film, photography, paper, pottery, baskets, so forth. As well as providing an informal, experimental, and creative space for collaboration between academic and non-academic. Many speakers are not university scholars. How do you bring their knowledge into the space? Sometimes museums are the way to do that. You bring everyone together and you treat everyone as a top expert. There's no hierarchy of knowledge here. This is key as communities need places that recognize their expertise. As many minority and indigenous groups have established museums following self-determination, creating exchanges and networks between local and national museums also helps this process. So many tribal communities have their own museums, and I'm sure in Europe this is also another pattern. There are many minority cultures that celebrate their culture through their local museums. Okay. So what is cultural revitalization programming in a museum? In the field of what has become known as cultural revitalization, I see it's very specific in my context in a museum. There are many different ways of interpreting what is cultural revitalization, but for today, we're looking at it within the museum base. So we envision the way in which museums, collections, and archives can be employed by communities to re-engage with knowledge that is dormant or severed from its original context because of culturally oppressive, colonial, governmental, or economic policies. These revitalization programs have encouraged a fundamental transformation of museums in the United States from institutions that privilege and depend on modes of authority from a Western perspective to multiple modes. So it's not one or the other, but multiple modes of knowledge through which indigenous and local knowledge can be generated, reconnected, and expanded. So it's also really recognizing there are multiple knowledge systems. There's not one system. For the past 10 years, Recovering Voices has been prioritizing projects that are developed and led by communities to address and support their intellectual inquiries, as well as their language and cultural knowledge revitalization needs. The majority of funded projects combine approaches for stimulating language via the use of traditional practices such as fishing, games, dress, art forms, and so forth. So this is the kind of work that we fund. Most are geared towards developing resources for educational programs that are run by the communities themselves. And these can be books for children, dictionaries, ethnobotanical, so taxonomies, and then as well how the young generation is using phones and phone apps to share language and so forth between the younger generation. So we do not do the production of the materials, but we help fund them. That makes sense. And we support that process. So we bring people in to work on collections, and then we try and help fund dissemination afterwards. So we have 3 branches of the program. The first is the community research program, and that's another one that I have established and that I run, and that's my baby. Then we also have a collaborative research channel where individual scholars can help develop projects and bring people together. So it's kind of the research branch. The community research program really champions communities rather than only academic work, and the collaborative is everything. And then we also have the Mother Tongue Film Festival. We have it once a year, and it's grown tremendously. It's a really, really great program. And we show films in native tongue from all over the world. So I'm going to talk primarily now about the community research program, which is really everything that I want to share with you about how to think about museums in the role of cultural and language revitalization. So the Community Research Program, or the CRP for short, operates using endowment funds. And we pay for communities to come from around the world to work on the collections. And I understand that endowment is slightly off topic, but I think it is something we should talk about. And it's a point I've come to right at the end of this lecture in how we want to think about some of these programs. So in using our funds, we run an annual open call. So we invite proposals from all over the world. And then we are able to fund about 3 to 4 groups each year. And they, in their proposals, they at least show some attempt to understand what collections we have, how they would use them, and potentially what kind of dissemination projects would they do once they're back home, and who are they going to work with at home. And then, as I say, we have groups that come from a week to groups that come for 2 months. Because it took 2 months for Wowja to arrive, it was sensible that they stayed for 2 months before they returned home. So the further you travel, the longer we try and support to visit for where you come to. So while working with the groups in collections, we create a collaborative convening space. Very important. So, you know, it seems so obvious, but it's not. You need a table, chairs around a table, give people a lot of time and comfort and care to have conversations with each other around the table. We videotape the conversations, but we try and stay as neutral and out of the picture as possible. So the camera often is just running and no one is at the camera. You're just doing what you need to do in front of the camera. And then every single person who's part of the group is given a flash drive with the videos on it. We discovered for the first couple of years, we gave 1 flash drive to each community, only to discover that people were squirreling them away, not sharing them with the rest of their group, which, you know, we were surprised by. So now every single person who comes gets their own flash drive. And so it's really understood that the whole idea is the more you can help with the dissemination back home, you know, the better the outcome. There's sort of 3 types of things that come out of these visits. The development of language databases and dictionaries. Often, you know, we have a linguist who is the dictionary they're working on, and they can create all sorts of new content for it, working on our, you know, sort of some of the historic material. The revival of material cultural knowledge, so how to make things that maybe have gone out of, you know, use. And then also the sort of helping build educational materials for use in classrooms or workshops. For many Native American communities I work with, they have summer camps. That's really one of their only ways. How do you say summer camp in Spanish?
Campamento de verano.
Okay. So, verano? See. Intensive summer camps with no disruption, because it is so difficult to take the language into the schoolroom when that's, you know, 2 hours a week, 3 hours a week, it just doesn't work. So we're also trying to help, like, what kind of programming can they build games, songs, all these kind of things to teach the children during the summer camp. So when convening around the objects and articulating and reporting the techniques and materials used, they're often talking about, you know, what was used to make this, how did you prepare it? And there's a huge amount of language material that can be lost that comes back in these kinds of discussions of, like, what are the names of the tools and so forth. And we often find that people forgot what they forgot. And then all of a sudden they're there and they say, now I remember, you know, so forth, because they're having a whole conversation about what it takes to create this shirt and so forth. And one of the important things is to have these intergenerational groups so that the younger generation can learn right there in front of that, you know, elder who's speaking, rather than having educational material created and not having going home. So we try and make sure that the youth and the elders come together as part of the group. So after running the program for 10 years, myself and Al Cordier, he's the young gentleman with the blue shirt, he and I decided to do interviews with the community members who had already participated to learn what was working and what was not working about the program. And the interviews were very helpful. We discovered all sorts of things that we needed to know. So one of them was that people truly underestimated the knowledge that they had before they went into the museum. They often felt like, oh, I won't remember anything about, you know, fishing or so forth. And then while they're in that environment, as I say, many sort of things come up. So there was one participant who was impressed at the extent to which her group, once in the presence of objects, was able to work together to unlock and combine the various forms of expertise, to identify the names of the objects, local names, you know, place names around the sort of collecting of materials, what the objects are used for, and so forth. And it can be watching this process. It can be a little bit like picking a lock. You know, it might take 6 or 7 people sitting around, kind of going, well, what did we call it when we were kids? And how did we do this? And do you remember? And one person gives a little bit, another person gives a little bit, and then, you know, sometimes, not always, it comes together and then it's there. Now, these are often language groups that just don't have some of this language material operating right now in the community. So it may be different from what's going on here, but that's just to say when you're revitalizing a language, you are dealing with often gaps in the knowledge. So the other thing that we learned from these interviews, that people felt really rewarded by being treated as the expert. Because often for most of their lives, they were always treated as an outsider, non-specialist, non-academic, nothing to add to the conversation. But in this environment where they're talking about farming equipment or making cheese and all of the kind of knowledge that goes into this, they're the experts, and that is very important. And then their information is recorded, it becomes part of the museum records, and then they also feel like this is establishing an archive of this kind of knowledge for them and their future generation. So it's also about addressing the balances. And again, it may be different here in Spain, but in the US, many tribes were studied. They were not the scholars of their own culture, right? So this is a real shift in the way in which the scholarship is also being done. So one of the other things, and this image is of a group of 3 women who from the Michoacan region who just were, again, I found so phenomenal, partly to do with the sort of the difficulties of working in their community, some of the kind of stressors, but they've created their own community project around weaving that's also part of language. So this is what is the relationship between, teaching the weaving and working with the language. And they're also fierce environmentalists. So we learned a huge amount from this group. So one of the things that also happens is this idea that you're not just like recognizing a type of object and saying, here is the correct word for it, and then you report it and you're done. Part of it was actually having whole discussions around incorrect taxonomy that was in the museum. This object does not represent this, it's a ceremonial item anymore. It really allowed for a much deeper conversation and for people to realign how things are understood and come together almost as the cosmology, cosmological knowledge base within the museum. During the CRP visits, this raised discussions around the dynamics between nomenclature versus how language is lived and used within the community. And the Anishinaabe group that participated with us, and this is the image of Maya and Mary Ann, really spoke Anishinaabe. This is a group from Manitou Island that has just had less disruptions, although Mina did explain she had been to boarding school, but she went to a particular kind of boarding school that was quite remote, and actually this language, her own language was being used in the boarding school. And she had also been raised by families who were fluent, and she stayed fluent. And those are the individuals that are really revered in these kinds of projects because they have the conversancy of the language way beyond many people. And then Mary Ann Corbier is a linguist who teaches at the community college. So she's helping transfer this kind of very fluent level of Anishinaabe to the young students in the community college. But they had never had a museum visit before where they were allowed to use their language, which I didn't quite understand. It seemed baffling, but that's what they said. They said, we're brought to museums all the time, and we give lectures on how to make little boxes and how to do this, and it's all done in English. So, you know, they gave us some very powerful quotes about how incredibly different it was to have a period of time with their, what they refer to as ancestral belongings, using their language, you know, that this was a very different environment. So part of what also happens in that space is there's a lot of storytelling. It's not just you sit and talk about object, people very quickly go to, you know, stories about boarding schools or, you know, the introduction of television in the community. All these kinds of things become part of it becomes a sort of an oral history opportunity. And they also, these methods encourage an immersive environment, you know, for the younger generation who are there to kind of learn all of how it all comes together. Participants also placed a great deal of emphasis on the value of spending in-person time with the group in the collection. And I say that because museums keep pushing digitization, and that's where the money goes right now. You're in the museum business and you have a big collection, you might be facing this or have already tried. But for many communities who want to work with the museum and work with the objects, the digitization process may be one facet. You can use it in your educational programming. You can download images of things and use them, but it is not a knowledge living network, a conversation around an object. So we learned that this was really important. As Ruth Phillips, one of the scholars who was working with the Anishinaabe, said, that this kind of research stimulates personal responses and queries about technical processes that cannot be apprehended through digital images alone. Oftentimes people may never have seen the object in person, they've only ever seen photographs, and they have these, you know, these aha moments, you know, in encountering that object. So for one individual, she said, it increased my love for museums. I want more. I want to look at more of it. The things that's being collected from our people from long ago, we are in awe. So, you know, this can be a very reverential process for people. So an appreciation for materiality is recognized as an important concept in museum anthropology already. It's an area of study, as well as object-based learning within general sort of pedagogical discussions. But how much has been done within language revitalization? Maybe people here can tell me. I don't think very much. So this is something that we're interested in. One of my favorite stories is I've worked for years with a Hopi potter, Karen Charlie. This is an image of Karen. I'm realizing it has the wrong label title on it, so ignore that. But you know, Karen has been known in the U.S. as one of the most famous canteen pottery canteen water container artists of her generation. So she's very famous. She's in a lot of museums. She's very well regarded. And, you know, she's now interested in bringing the younger generation of Hopi potters into the museum to learn more about the traditional pottery, because a lot has changed. But she was finding actually that there were construction methods that were used by her ancestors that were better than what she uses for the canteens. So you can build it upside down or you can build it right side up, and one is much more efficient, and she was doing it the hard way, and she was like, who knew they had a much better way for making these? But you can't do that from photographs. This takes shining, you know, flashlights on the inside. Having museum people allow you to have a huge amount of hands-on experience so that you can kind of feel the insides of an object. So I don't stop people from handling. I let people sometimes pick apart a bit of a fabric to see how it's made. This sounds terrible. I've let people play flutes, you know, shake rattles. I feel like if you're revitalizing a language, why would you not revitalize the objects? Why should they sit there silent, untouched, which is the general kind of museum approach to them? That's not going to save our languages. So in another example, we worked with the Wanapum from Oregon, and this is a fascinating story. They were removed in the 1950s and 60s. Now I can't remember, it's the Hannaford side, where the US government built a nuclear testing facility. And they were removed. I mean, this is a recent removal, complete removal from this area. but they signed papers that said, if we let you come back, you can fish this river again if you use your traditional fishing methods. I'm not sure. This is, I think, a legal, possibly in Roman law. I'm sort of learning this now, that a lot of the sort of rights to things come out of traditional techniques, as if they're still used, that somehow you still have rights to the resources. So they had a language revitalization project, but it was also based on bringing back the traditional fishing techniques. And this weight that is in this photograph is a phenomenal piece of engineering. It's designed for a very specific part of a river where there are lots of boulders, and you're trying to get your salmon, and your nets will get caught in your boulders. So you need a wheel that will bounce along the bottom of the boulders and not get caught. And it has a weight that kind of allows it to swim in line. I mean, it's beautifully sophisticated, but hasn't been used for, 60 plus years. And so the elders and the youth are working together on trying to remake these, go back onto the Columbia River and start fishing again. But when they brought the wood and all of the materials with them and started the process, we had to put everything in freezers because it's a museum, get rid of the pack and so forth. And then we had a workroom for them to spend, literally like weeks and weeks trying to figure out how do you recreate this? The first thing they said was, we brought the wrong kind of wood because in the photo we thought it was X, but now we're looking at it, it's Y. So that tells you literally how important it is to have these hands-on approaches. So this is also a point that utilitarian objects, the quotidian, the everyday, super important to language revitalization, but often something that, museums haven't thought about. We like art, we like the sort of the high culture where we often are not invested. And so many of the communities were very excited about finding things they hadn't seen since they were children. It was like watching some of the elders. It's like a kid in a candy store. So there's one nice quote. I'm making for time. Is it okay? Okay. There's one quote that I really like that came from Mina, again, who's the elder from Manitou Island. So she said, "I'd seen some of the things before, but a long time ago. You don't see those things anymore. They were common, so our people didn't save them. I saw a grinder, a food grinder, and I hadn't seen it since I was a child. We're just not using them anymore. So I had to stop and think, what are they called? And I could not remember. But suddenly when I picked it up, I heard my grandmother scold me and say, don't touch the grinder." And she remembered the word. And I remembered the word and it came back to me. So, just the handling of it, again, triggers this, her grandmother's voice shouting, "Don't touch the grinder" at her grinder. And then she remembers what the word is. And another really wonderful anecdote, again, so we had two different groups of Wauja. It's a very gender specific oriented society. Women do things, men do things. So the men came first in 2016, and the women came in 2024, just recently, just this last summer, we hosted the women. Very different experiences too, very different knowledge realms. And so we now have a collection that has the sort of the male version of everything, and we have the female version. But when the three gentlemen who came to visit from Wauja, they were in the fish collection. And one of the elders pointed out, I'll read the quote, he saw fish specimens that he as a young boy had collected for the biologist. So some 60 years ago, a biologist had come to the Zinga River, and this individual had actually collected the fish for him, and they are now in the Smithsonian. And he didn't know that, and we didn't know that. So he chuckled to remember that he'd been paid in caramel candies, we'll say, for the fish. And then the staff, insisted on adding his name, Kuratu Wauja, to the specimen tags of the handful of small fish he had collected so long ago. There's a big move in our museum to recognize the knowledge that communities have played in this kind of, nation building exercise by many natural history museums or national museums, in which the individuals, the local individuals, their names were never included. So this is kind of one of those examples where we feel that it really helps to show how much importance there is in the local knowledge and how it makes these kinds of collections possible. There's also a spiritual aspect to a lot of the visits with Indigenous groups. So many of them are doing smudging and prayers before the visit, both before they go in to see collections and when they're done. And a lot of that is, there is perceived harm by the fact that these things may be removed from communities and from religious practice and from being kept properly. And so there's a fear that if you contact them, that you could get sick. So we have ceremonial rooms with a fan, people can do smudging in them and so forth. So our museum's learning how to create spaces that really help traditional practices. There's another story of a group who from the plains who came, and there was a drum, and they took the drum out and they were sort of banging the drum and were saying it sounds so nice, and then they tried to put it back in the box, and no matter how hard it just wouldn't go back into the box. So one of them said, well, it wants us to sing. So then they sang many songs, and then it fit right back into the box. So they put it away, and everyone says, it just needed to be sung. So there's this almost this kind of relationship that needs to happen again. And, these are I'm describing to you a very particular kind of cultural value system. It's not the same everywhere. But there's an idea that objects have animacy. They are like people. So if they have been locked away for years and years and they have no relationship with anyone, then there's a grief. So you need to re-establish your relationship. The objects often are referred to as the same as the boarding school generation. So I think when we think about the destruction, certainly in the US, of Native cultures, you cannot discount what happened. It wasn't just that there were colonial practices. There's also the breaking up of the family. Absolutely. You break up the family. That's the best way to stop people from practicing their culture. This is an image of children who were taken from their homes and sent to Pennsylvania. So sent from all over the US. And they had their hair cut, their clothes taken. They weren't allowed to speak their languages. I just participated in a healing coalition for survivors from boarding schools. And there's still just a huge amount of grief. So there's a lot of research now on intergenerational trauma. And that's not unusual to most societies. I think we have that. And then the question is, in these revitalization projects, do we manage that space? So for the communities I work in, that is a necessity. You have to understand that you need to recognize the impacts of the trauma. What's that? How does that manifest itself? So the removal of the objects is seen as similar as to the removal of their children or of their parents or their grandparents. But the interesting thing is that it's not all trauma. It's also about re-socializing the objects back into their people. So it's also seen as a potential way of healing some of the trauma. So that the objects are both seen as evidence of historic trauma and disruption, but also as a potent for instruments of change. So we can have both the sort of the negative and the positive within these objects, but it all has to be managed very carefully. So we're in the process of developing protocol around this. So we just started in the last couple of years interviewing people specifically about what kind of protocol that they like that would start working towards some of the practices that would heal some of the trauma. The Smithsonian has also started a what we refer to as ethical returns and shared stewardship. And the idea, especially for tribes and African American communities who don't come under some of the laws, is, what were the objects taken unethically, and therefore can they be returned? That's one option. And unethical literally could be everyone was starving, no one had any food. An anthropologist arrived and said, I'll give you some blankets if you give me all of your belongings, and that's just not a fair trade at that stage. So that's the kind of thing we're having to go through the records and see what were the premises of the collecting. So So all the visits are video recorded. And then, as I mentioned, they go back to the individuals. But what we've also found in this process is that while people are recorded, they're also bearing witness. This is testimony. This is not just, oh, I want to talk about this pottery. This is also a project in saying, I want you to know some of the things that none of you up until this point have ever asked about or ever recorded. You've only ever been interested in what kind of clay do we use? What kind of pigments do we use? But we need to tell you that we were sent to boarding school. So it's hard for me to talk about this object because it was my grandmother's and I didn't see her, for, 10 years and so forth during my childhood. So that becomes part of the record. And I think a lot of people discounted this as being museum information or anthropology, but I'm discovering that this, this is the community story. So it becomes important as part of this testimony. So part of this then becomes, are we running a program that has to think about the rebalancing of power relationships and the redistribution of funds and power and so forth? And of course, yes, that's become very clear that we have to be conscious about that. And have partners, have community members who work with us as advisory members to make sure that the program is meeting the needs of the community. So, oh my God, 10 minutes. Okay. All right. So I just want to refer to some of the and this, if people are interested, the website that I've listed up here, and we can provide, it gives you all of this information about ethical returns and shared stewardship and what was that, what's that history and why did that come into being. But in terms of the international projects that we do, we're learning that a lot of the information we're interested in is this idea of the kinship group, that you have a huge amount of information that is kept within families. And so on the one hand, the community research program is very focused on that. But how do you then expand, extrapolate, and sort of recalibrate at an international level, which is very much being part of quite a lot of Indigenous groups want to work internationally. They want to train other people. They want to, be part of conversations at a broader level. They may feel, like very much in the Brazilian case, that they themselves have no representation in Brazil. They want to see representation in the US. So how do you build these kinds of projects? And we've also discovered that even if people come from the same town, they might not talk to each other. So even if you have a language revitalization project and you need this kind of convening of knowledge, it's just not possible. People have very complicated lives and, so paying people to take time off and spend time together, you sometimes in those discussions, we often hear people say like, this is so nice that we've spent time together. We don't, and you think it's so funny, why did they have to come to Washington, DC to get to know each other? But this is part of this, like building the network. So the international one I see is an extension of this kind of kinship network, is kind of helping people understand that at a broader sense, but also then building just this wider network of people who support this kind of work. So I'm just going to skip through some images. So on the image of the woman with the basket, this is mine. When she was first approached by people who wanted to put a group together, and they were working on an Anishinaabe dictionary, and they wanted to bring the group. So we don't necessarily invite the group. They apply for funding and then select proposal. But she called me up after her group had been selected, and she said, I don't want to travel alone. I'm too elderly and I need to bring my husband. And in old school, and this was, I think, my second year of running the program. In the old school system, you would have said, great, you pay for your husband. He's not part of the project. But I had this feeling of like, she's asking me to be inclusive, be sort of friendly and generous. So I said, of course, and we'll fund him, bring your husband. So, so Mina brought her husband, Ted, and mine is the one that is flown around the US to give lectures on quill work. that she does. She's a beautiful quilter in English. But this was a chance, as I've said, for them to come and work as a family and talk in Anishinaabe. And Ted asked Al if he could just wander up and down the shelves a little bit one day. And I just, because, you know, he's quite quiet for the first couple of days. He said, can I just wander up and down the shelves? And we were like, of course, okay. And so he did that, and then he opened one of the cabinets, and it was all of this equipment used for maple syrup collection and making of maple syrup. And he's just super, super excited, crying with excitement. And he's like, I haven't seen any of this since I was a child. We're going to do a project on it. So he and Al now do videos. It's just the first of many that they've done. But they talk very passionately, you know, in these videos. They walk through the environment. They're teaching the kids, what are the trees that you select? What time of year? What are some of the religious things you need to know? The trees of brothers and sisters. And it's all very environmental. If you take from this tree, you have to wait till you take from that tree. And I mean, it's a very, very sort of important level of knowledge. But it came from the fact that Ted was this appendage. But what we found out is that he collected the bark that Mina uses to create her baskets. He collects the porcupine. He gets the roadkill that becomes the porcupine that becomes the quill basket work. So again, it was a reminder that many museums have siloed and separated knowledge. There's natural history here. There's, you know, fine art over here, but that's not at all how a community of knowledge exists. So, so this is the kind of knitting back together of knowledge that we're looking at. Okay. So in terms of international collaborations, I'm going to just mention two. We have, we work with ARNet, which is in Mexico City, but their role is to also link Canada, the US, and Mexico through research. So we have a project called Indigenous, which supports some technological innovation. It has just started, so we don't have any products yet. We just have an advisory team. And then just recently, and this is Omar Sanchez, who works, he's one of the founders of the project. He does this amazing work where he's teaching his youth in his mixed tech community to recreate the codices, you know, using their kind of sort of creating their own illustrations. But again, like really kind of taking what was a traditional practice and then bringing it back into the schools. And we now have also his partner, Zaire, will be the leader of the initiative. So we want very much for a community member to lead the initiative. But these are the kind of international projects that we're trying to build. And we all met in Mexico City, and we had people from Europe and Canada and the US and Mexico. And it was a very interesting, intense week where we learned a lot about how, as academics, we are not, the tech industry is not our friend. And some of the people we invited are indigenous people who are designing tech for mining companies or, you know, Google or whatever. So a lot of this was also a negotiation of power between, even if they're all indigenous, the fact was there were people who had resources and people who didn't. So it was a very interesting kickoff to the project. We do film festivals and we do workshops. And I'm going to rush through the last thing. Okay, so I see I have 2 minutes. So I want to make recommendations. I've been in conferences before where you absorb a lot of this information, but then you're asking yourself, what am I supposed to do with some of the things, the issues that have been raised? So I have 5 things that are recommendations coming from some of the experiences I have. Admittedly, I'm working with multiple language groups, so these are very general. But the first is that families have to be funded. It cannot just be an academic endeavor. You have to let la familia. The second thing is your informal setting, like a museum, helps you have an experimental space between the academy and the community, where sometimes community members who will not set foot in the library or the school or the university will set foot in a museum and will work on projects. The third is that place-based knowledge is really proving to be something that that people will fund because, and this is for better or worse, we talk about this. People are interested in the, in the environmental future. What is the local knowledge that is held about the community by community members that maybe it hasn't been honored? That's also part of this process. Putting the community in the driving seat, making sure that they are code designers in the research from the start. You get much more interesting projects that you wouldn't necessarily have thought. And then lastly, and this is probably very controversial, you need a local network of donors, people who volunteer and people who fund. That can be local businesses. Maybe they're just, sharing bread, helping bring bread to one of the meetings. But the fact is that there, for all the communities I've worked with, if there isn't on the ground buy-in, that's probably a very rare expression. It's not a fully supported effort. But if everybody's involved at a small level, it means that they are learning to show each other that they care. And over time, they can build these kinds of, like a strength to the program. And that's because if we don't tie this at some level to resources, our efforts to resources, it can be seen that a language that is endangered is a luxury. And my argument is that it's not a luxury, but you have to help people understand it's not a luxury. But that is literally so from the ground up. People provide anything, something small, just so that they're all involved and that they understand what's at stake. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I'm going to give the floor, if I may, to the audience in case someone wants to ask you a question. ¿Alguna pregunta, por favor? Puede hacer en inglés o si no en asturiano la intento transmitir a la ponencia. I just came up with a very good question about is it possible to preserve or revitalize a language without taking into account the cultural base, cultural traditional knowledge?
No.
Yes.
Very easy answer.
Or maybe, for example, communities, not all the members of the community are interested in preserving their language because they could be unconcerned because they have other basic needs and
Yeah.
How is it possible to persuade them to collaborate, or is it simply better to ignore them?
While I think about it, you can answer the question.
Le estoy preguntando si es posible desasociar un proyecto para preservar o revitalizar una lengua sin tener en cuenta lo que tiene que ver con la transmisión de cultura, de las tradiciones culturales, que se puede hacer solamente lo que es la preservación de la lengua. Y si es importante también conseguir el apoyo de un gran número de miembros de la comunidad, no solamente teniese a unas personas que parecen que están interesadas en preservar la cultura y la lengua, como ocurre en muchas comunidades nativas americanas.
So I would say that language is a relationship with the world. So if you don't have it represent all these important relationships between people, between the place, between family, then it's a language without a relationship, and that is a problem. So at some level, for a language really to survive, you really want as many relationships strengthened and kept together as possible, or grown and created, recreated, to have that language be vital. But in America, there are many communities where 99% of the people do not speak the language, and they feel it will never happen. And in those cases, it's understood that whatever you can do is also still important because it's considered cultural vitality. So don't talk about language as culture, talk about cultural vitality. So there I can share a scholar, Bernie's Pearl, who is modestly has written about vitality, because he's worried that then communities feel bad that they don't have their language anymore, and that's not okay. You need to support the community feeling okay that they don't have their language, but they still have their culture. But my feeling is the community together needs to talk about what they want and then work together. So if they want the language, that requires lots of relationships and strong relationships and feeling connected to the language and good about the language. And if they decide that it's okay that the language goes, then they can focus on multilinguality. Does that help?
Bueno, estudiar y preservar una lengua es imposible no hacerlo de forma aislada, es importante tener en cuenta a toda la comunidad, cuanto más mejor, y sobre todo intentar no solamente preservar la lengua, sino hacerles que lo utilicen, y por eso intentan inmergir el proyecto de preservar la lengua también en la cultura, en este caso de los nativos, les intentan juntar familias, incluso llevándoles a los sitios donde antiguamente habitaban para intentar recrear la atmósfera antigua y para que intenten recordar todas las tradiciones antiguas en compañía de las personas más mayores de la comunidad. No sé si alguien quiere preguntar algo más.
You can say that people want to see the paper. You don't have it, unfortunately. Oh, no, just, there's just a way that like people can ask for a copy of the full paper. But it will be legal.
Ya, se pide que os transmita que está dispuesta a compartir la publicación con quien quiera leerla. Bueno, vamos un poco más de tiempo. Antes de la pausa, sí que me gustaría presentar el siguiente bloque. El siguiente bloque va a estar conformado por las últimas dos ponencias del Congreso antes de la clausura final. El profesor, filósofo, lingüista y escritor Roberto González Quevedo, el principal organizador de este extraordinario evento, va a presentar una ponencia que tiene por título la revista Cultura, Unidad y Diversidad de la Cultura Asturiana, y acto seguido el profesor José Antonio González Riaño, catedrático en Ciencia de la Educación de la Universidad de Oviedo y presidente de la Academia de la Lengua Asturiana, nos va a ofrecer la contribución de la Academia de la Lengua Asturiana a la defensa y el estudio de la cultura asturiana. Es un poco extraño que presente unas ponencias cuando todavía falta media hora, pero era mi interés en primer lugar porque tengo que irme y segundo pues, para dar las gracias a ellos y también al estupendo y formidable equipo de trabajo que forman la Academia por haber hecho posible este extraordinario evento, este extraordinario congreso y darles gracias por todo lo que he aprendido y disfrutado de ellos. Muchas gracias.